Welcome everyone to this post-debate roundup discussion retrospective. I thought I'd make the title as sweet and sharp as possible. This is a joint production between Pod Media and Rational Standard. Please remember to follow Pod Media and Rational Standard on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. This evening I'm joined by Hermann Pretorius, the Deputy Head of Policy Research at the RR, and Martin van Staden, Head of Legal Policy and Research at the Free Market Foundation. My name is Chris. I'm a contributor for the Rational Standard and also the project manager at the Free Market Foundation. It's my job to try and get Martin to do some work every now and then. This discussion follows on from a very friendly and lively debate that happened on the 25th of May on Politiek. The topic was individualism versus communitarianism. Please, I recommend that you go and watch the original debate on the Politiek Facebook and YouTube channels. We got the idea for this post-debate roundup from Ernst and Ernst van Staden, two of the contributors and participants, along with Martin and Hermann in the original debate. So we want to thank them very much for their continued engagement on this topic. You can find their post-debate discussion on the Conscious Karakal YouTube channel. I highly recommend that you go and watch it. All right, gentlemen, I thought we would kick off with your retrospectives on what happened on Monday. Maybe just get your take on how you think it went, maybe some of the highlights for you, some things that stood out that you would like to touch on, and then we'll get into more of the meat and potatoes, as I like to say. Hermann, I'll start with you.
Yeah, well, it's I think one should start with thanking everyone for making this debate possible. I mean, it's a cliche, and perhaps a liberal cliche, to believe in this exchange of ideas and civility when not necessarily fitting into the group. So I think it was a positive interaction, and I know the two Ernsts, and I appreciate the contribution they make in South Africa, and in the battle of ideas, making sure that a range of views are heard. Sometimes we will agree, sometimes we will disagree, and it was an interesting experience, the debate. We agreed on a few things broadly, but it's almost as if the debate really identified stark and if I may say, a few unpredictable arguments. My problem, of course, my mistake often is that I love debating, and I did a lot of debating, and the mistake might be to go into a debate like this with a set idea of this is how a debate works, this is where the onus rests, and that doesn't always happen in such a natural, free-flowing discussion. So that frustrated me, but I mean, that's issue not anyone else's problem. But what stood out for me was I heard definitional aspects of liberalism that I've never encountered before, and a few things that I would deeply, deeply contest.
Thanks, Hermann. Martin, for you, I listened to the post-debate discussion from Ernst Squared this morning, and Ernst van Staden mentioned the Bible verse of iron sharpening iron. So that's how he sort of looked at the debate as a retrospective, and I think that's quite a nice way of looking at it. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I really think this is great. This conversation between call it liberal individualism, because I know socialists also think they're individualists, but I think we all know what we're talking about when we talk about individualism in our context. Between that and what I would consider a very moderate form of communitarianism. I don't know if the two Ernsts would feel insulted if I call them moderate. I don't consider them to be radical, as you say, that my community is going to do what it wants and we will mow you down if you get in our way. So I think that they are quite level-headed, and they do clearly have, even though they may not say so enough, but they clearly have a love for individual freedom that I would say is quite liberal. As I mentioned in the show, AfriForum is what I consider to be one of the foremost organizations in this country fighting for individual rights, and that, I think that's a great thing, and for that I think it's great that we're having these conversations. But like on the I guess on debate tactics itself, I think that they did something very smart, I guess, and they put us on the defensive almost immediately. So I guess I have to take my hat off to them on that. That did give us the opportunity to discuss individualism and liberalism far more than we discussed communitarianism. So I think we marketed our ideas more. We got that opportunity, and they admitted as much yesterday in their post-debate show. But it's never nice to be on the defensive, because it sounds like you're apologizing, you're conceding, and you're defending, and they are proactive and so on. So take my hat off to them. It was very smart of them to put us on the defensive so quickly, even though I think the debate was actually something that the onus was on them to show. So kudos to them in that regard. And yeah, I think it's great that we all went into it and came out of it with high spirits and with friendship, and that at no point did we sling mud at each other or really get to a point of irritating or frustrating each other. And I think everyone has agreed that this is only the first step. And I definitely look forward to more interacting with them specifically and with others from their camp, and definitely pulling in some more liberals and individualists on our side to also start this discourse, because I think a lot of people, this idea about preaching to the choir gets a bad rap, but I think in South Africa we haven't done enough of that. I think a lot of people in our broad pro-freedom-ish camp have lost their way because we don't really talk to them anymore. So I am a big fan of this, and I think we need to continue this discourse for many years to come.
In South Africa, the question: is there a choir to preach to? So,
somewhat.
I was going to mention how I was surprised when I tuned in on Monday and I saw two guys arguing for one side and two arguing for the other, because I thought all of us in the pro-freedom camp share exactly the same position. So, we're all of one mind, all of one hive mind. So on that note, I have to give all of you credit, because I quite enjoyed that. Just to kick off on some more substantive, talking points, a big aspect that came up in the whole discussion was theory versus practice. So the idea of, if your theory doesn't work in practice, what is it worth? That was very much pointed towards liberalism. Just for me, I've never really liked the idea of thought experiments. I think proper philosophy isn't just about the abstract realm. I think it has to be done in the context of the real world. You formulate ideas in terms of human experience, lived experience, how humans interact with each other, and what the proper politics or ideas should be that sort of guide how people ought to interact. Of course, people are never going to interact like we maybe would like or we expect to. That's part of Hayek's knowledge problem. But I think there's something to be said for formulating your ideas in the actual world. And I think liberalism has a very strong history of people sharpening their ideas in the world, of debating things, of trying to figure out what are the best rules to conduct ourselves by in our interactions with each other. So, Hermann, I'll start with you. Just your take on the theory versus practice, maybe a dichotomy. I think it's a false dichotomy, but I just wanted to get your take on that first.
Yeah, I think it's very much like you said, the best theories are the practical ones. So I don't think there necessarily has to be this contest, but it's very convenient to. That's why it's a problem debating philosophy. I mean, I like debating philosophy. I like debating logic. I might not be very good at it, but there is value in exploring an idea in the abstract, but there's also value in exploring ideas in the concrete. However, if it's going to be a debate about theory versus practicalities, we can go on about the idea of a theoretical or a practical debate, but in reality, liberalism, individual liberalism, have a very practical legacy to be proud of. And I do think that was a point that Martin made, but I think we could have made it better. You have these people like the Amish, like Oranje, individual within a framework of individualism. Now, the mistake we should avoid here is when we endorse individualism, or when we use Oranje as an example, we're not saying that Oranje is functioning within the perfect individualist liberal framework, we are saying it is an outflow from at least some elements of a liberal framework. And the same with the Amish. I think no country is perfectly liberal. I mean, you'll never encounter the perfect Lockean state, and there we go. But if you look at the practicalities, then liberalism and individualism have practical legacies to be proud of. The Amish, Orania, even certain forms of nationalism are allowable within the individual sphere. In fact, I think all forms of nationalism might be, because individualism in and of itself isn't. It's a starting point. It's a starting point. It's not this atomistic approach to say that there's the individual and there's nothing else. It's if you're going to identify actors, deciders, and legal subjects, then you have to start at the individual. You can get aggregates and conglomerates and groups on top of that, but the practicalities of individualism and liberalism, I mean, there's a lot to be said for it. And I think more practical examples of that leading to human prosperity and flourishing than perhaps the collectivist or the communitarian idea.
Yeah,
Martin,
I would say that.
Sorry, I was going to say, yeah, you can run with that one, and also just talk a little bit about the difference, if you think there's overlap between the two or not. So for me, the liberalism, the primacy of the individual, and the communitarianism, maybe primacy of the group kind of thing. But how do you think those might dovetail?
Look, I think let me start with 2 points here, and I think the first point is I don't think in any kind of debate that the distinction between theory and practice is at all productive. I think it's a tactical thing to do. I don't think it really ever gets into the substance. And people who follow me on social media will know that I have this love-hate relationship or hate relationship with so-called pragmatism. And I think the same thing applies in this context, because whoever you ask, it doesn't matter if it's someone who believes in unicorns, if it's a communist, a liberal, a communitarian, it doesn't matter. They think, and they sincerely think, that whatever it is they believe in is practical. They think it's in touch with reality, and it's in touch with human nature, and they will make a very strong argument for why that is. It doesn't matter how kooky we think communists are. They will sit you down on a table and they will explain to you in minute detail why it is what they believe works, and they may even have examples. We may disagree that those examples actually work, but they're going to have the conversation. And so I don't think it's productive to get into that. I'm more interested in a discussion about the merits of these principles that conflict or intention than with whether they work. I mean, the discussion about whether they work is important, but I think to just say you're being theoretical and I'm being practical, or I'm being practical and you're being theoretical, I don't think that is necessarily productive, because we will have examples of communitarianism that were tried and didn't work. I made a few of them. Then I was accused of invoking Godwin's law, but I'm sure we're going to get into that later. And then just the second point that Hermann made very well, and that is that I think liberalism should be seen as a framework. It's not the content. A lot of people, and the Ernst said this in their roundup again, and I think this is a very common misconception, and that is that liberalism is so-called insufficient. It doesn't have an answer to all of life's troubles. It doesn't answer every question that one could pose, and liberalism is very conscious of this. It never claimed to be a all-encompassing world philosophy that has an answer to all questions. It claims one thing, and that is that this framework of individual rights allows you to put on your own content. That it throws the ball into your court, into the court of your community, to decide what the content is, to be the Amish, to be Orania. You color in the lines. Liberalism is the framework, and that framework is a set of very simple rules that are often overanalyzed. And those rules are simple. You cannot use force against those around you to impose your will on them. We definitely need to get in this idea of imposing your will on others, because there's the Ernst say that's at the core of what liberalism is. There, you're imposing your liberalism on others, and I think we need to get into that a little bit later. But yeah, and then just on the overlap, this is a point me and Hermann made very repeatedly, and it's something that communitarians I don't know. They'll say thank you for conceding it, but then they'll immediately forget the concession. Not that it is a concession, but the point is that communitarianism inside is allowed in an individual framework. That's the whole point. There's no tension between communitarianism and individualism. These are not two opposites, of course, depending how you define it. So there is almost 100% overlap, because all that liberal individualism tells you is you decide. If you decide to be communitarian, there you go, done. Liberalism.
Ernst Roets had this very he worded it, and so the fact that this absolute voluntarism, I mean, that's awful. How can people be completely free to choose? And I think that's just a nonsense. I don't think you and I even believe in, liberalism or individualism equals unparalleled individual choice. But one thing I want to say about the theory and practice point, this is a thing that I think people who criticize communism, but shallowly criticize it, often make, is it's a mistake they make. They say socialism or communism is good in theory, but it's bad in practice. No, it's bad in theory. It's worse in practice. So this theory practice thing is actually a very useful thing to look at. It's not that communism is a cute idea. It's that it's an idea that essentially says, you don't own your labor, you don't own your time, you don't own your freedom. So it's not that it's pity the reality didn't adjust to the theory. No, the theory is stupid and reality just showed that. So but the thing that we also, I think, need to emphasize is in an individual society, part of the choice or individualist liberal society, part of the freedom of the individual is to seek to voluntarily limit some of their own freedoms. That is how I can be a member of a relatively conservative Christian grouping and still be a liberal, because I acknowledge the choice to freely be a conservative. It's almost like I'm a liberal because I want everyone to have the right to believe as I believe. But the question really boils down to what's the role of the state? What does the state do? And I had a conversation with one of my colleagues earlier today. They said, if someone wants to do heroin, let them do it. And I thought, that's not how I feel about it. I would try to convince them not to do the heroin, but I wouldn't call the police to, from the barrel of a gun, stop them from taking the heroin. So that's the difference here, is the individualist is not the anarchist. The individualist does not hate the group. The individualist just says, if we're going to be granular, if we're going to be honest, and we're going to identify who can act, who can decide, and who can be legal subjects, then it is illogical to have that entity of action, decision, and legal subjectivity not be the individual. And I'm frustrated by the debate, because I don't think we shifted the burden of proof sufficiently to them to say, if not individualism, then you're positing some other legal subject. Could you please define that legal subject for us? When does it start to exist? When does it stop to exist? When does it act? When doesn't it act? How can it be held accountable? And an example I did want to use that I very, very fist for myself that I didn't use it, was this idea that if we grant the collectivist premise and the communitarian premise with all its wonderful things, but we undermine the individualist nature, then justicial accountability dies a very awkward death, because then you have the situation where the descendant of the land grabber can be held personally as a member of a group, be held accountable and liable and responsible by the descendant of the land loser. And then you sit in a situation where expropriation without compensation might well be justifiable. And the reason, from our point of view, that it's not justifiable, we're not making the historic case, even though there might be merit in that case. We're not saying no land was ever taken, even though I think the amount of land taken is vastly overblown. But I mean, the land was taken, that's undeniable. But the problem we have with expropriation without compensation is not you've got history wrong, it's you've got justice wrong. So you cannot take from the individual, you cannot infringe on their rights because some other possible member of a group that shared enough identifiers with this person did something wrong. That's not how justice works. And if you want to take collectivism and communitarianism to, I think, its logical conclusion, you reach a very uncomfortable place, and a very uncomfortable place that AfriForum or the two Ernst would ideally like to be in.
Hermann, before I let you go further justifying EWC from the communitarian perspective, I wanted to tease out a few things that both of you mentioned, just on this idea of the inevitable outflow of an ideology. So I felt it was a concern very much from the communitarian side that liberalism, atomistic individualism is utopian. So it's always inherently utopian. It's not going to be achieved. It's this pie in the sky kind of thing. But to me, I don't know, maybe I'm being facetious here, but all ideologies in some way want to pretend that they're utopian. They want to appeal to this narrative of, oh, just follow our ideology and we'll solve all your problems. I don't think they ought to. And I think liberalism is probably the most robust one that doesn't do that doesn't pretend to have all the answers for every single person, that it will let people pursue their freedom, try and pursue their ends, whether those, are the right ends for themselves, they're going to run into problems or not. But just that point on utopianism, do you think either one of the ideologies at discussion here, the viewpoints, inevitably lead there or have that problem? What do you think, Martin?
Well, look, I think it comes back to that practical versus theory thing again. So every theory, and I include communitarianism, even though the Ernst would say that there is no communitarian model. They just believe that communities should be able to decide for themselves. I would posit that is in itself a model. So every model has a grand ideal, and in that sense, yes, it is utopian. Liberalism says that in society, the state, so this is a mainstream liberalism, the state should protect liberty and property, and people should non-violently engage in open trade and voluntary cooperation with each other. That's liberalism. That's our utopia that we strive towards. It's not a utopia we've ever claimed to have achieved. It's never happened. So yes, you can come at me with the not real liberalism thing, but I also think that's a weak argument that we make against communists, just by the way. But that the fact is that there's also this communitarian utopia whereby each community that wants self-government gets self-government, and they make their own rules, and they decide. The community decides by, I don't know, majority vote. Do the aristocrats decide? I don't know where the community starts and ends. All of these are questions that I haven't received answers to. But it comes down to that there is an ideal communitarian idea, and in that sense, it's utopian as well. And they strive towards their ideal, and we strive towards our ideal. So I don't think there's any merit in saying, oh, but your ideology is utopian. I don't think that works. I also that gets a little bit into the so-called similarities between Marxism and liberalism. I think it was absolutism, utopianism, and the universalism, and yeah, we need to talk about imperialism. Write that down, Chris. But like the universalism as well. It's like this community idea that the Ernsts are talking about, that each community should be able to govern itself. That's itself an appeal to universalism, because they are saying that a community in Persia and Iran should be able to govern itself. We're saying that an individual in Persia or in Iran should be able to govern himself. These two ideas are universalistic in the exact same way. So I think it's counterproductive to get into that. And then, of course, I would say, yes, it's utopian, and so are they. We're all trying to attain our respective utopias. It's just I definitely deny that liberals have ever claimed that if we implement liberal ideas, then the planet Earth will turn into the land of milk and honey, and that everything will just be great. I know some economists may have made this argument based on some models, but that's definitely not our argument.
But I must, if I
well, I need to leave the liberalism camp then, because I thought we were heading that way. Sorry, Hermann.
Sorry, man. The liberalism camp is very different. In fact, there's not a camp. There's just a bunch of tents on an open plain. What I think we do need to be honest about is this problem that the group as an actor really runs into. There's I think an uncomfortability in saying that what do you mean when you say group? Because we can ask Ernst Roets, for example. He's a man, that's a group. He's white, that's another group. He's Afrikaans speaking, that's another group. He's an Afrikaner, that's another group. He's married, that's another group. He's a Christian, that's another group. And he's a father, that's another group. And so at least 7. I think you can still create other groups based on any other identifiers, but here we have at least 7 characteristics that can indicate membership of a group. The question then becomes, what group do you belong to? And it's ironic that at that point of being challenged as to your group membership, you execute an individual choice, not a group choice. You can choose between many groups. You, by necessity, can belong to, I think, an infinite number of groups. People who are left-handed, right-handed, blue eyes, brown eyes, blonde hair, no hair. I mean, every possible identifier can be expounded or elaborated into some group. Now, I'm not saying that's what communitarians do, but in theory, at some point, the identifier on which you decide to be your primal group identifier, the heart of your identity, you decide that by individual choice. And that's the irony here, that even group identification, the very act of belonging to a group, happens on the individual level.
Well, that relationship between the individual and the group, I think we should expand on a bit more, because I think another concern from the communitarian side is maybe because we're pushing for atomistic individualism or liberalism, we don't see any importance for groups. So the one precludes the other one, the one excludes the other one. But I think here, Martin, maybe you take it first. I think a liberal country, a liberal system as such, of course, people are going to make decisions and form part of groups that we might not agree with. But the point is there, if they find value in some of those groups, they can pursue it. Like Hermann has given the different categories, the different ways people can be part of different groups. And for them, it's an individual decision. But just go on a bit about that relationship, because I think it is a relationship. It's not one versus the other.
Look, this is probably the one thing that annoys me most about the communitarian arguments against liberalism and individualism, and I experience this a lot. I actually have a book here that I want to show our viewers that I've been reading. I'm actually done with it. I don't know if you can read that. It says Die bedreiging van liberalisme. That is the threat of liberalism. It was written by the historian G.D. Scholes in 1965.
Oh, here we go. Hermann, do you have the same one on your desk?
I'm not going to show it, but I have a few Scholzes. I recently acquired a few of them, but I might lose my job at the Institute of Race Relations if I'm a Scholzian.
So look, that's an argument that keeps being made, and I think it's important to emphasize that this argument is only made by the critics of individualism. This is not something that I may be wrong. I don't read thick doorstops on philosophy. Somewhere a philosopher may have said something about we as individualists believe that the individual is an atom. So I concede that someone may have said that. But what I have read, and it's political philosophy and stuff, legal philosophy, the mainstream stuff on individualism and on liberalism, I have never in my life seen this argument being made by anyone that we want society to be this free floating thing where individuals never come into contact and their rights This argument is made that individual rights distance us from one another, and it creates this distance. It makes us cold towards our fellow man, and this is what individual rights does. And it's there's no community, and we reject the idea of the group, and it's just the individual and the state. This is not an argument that has ever been made, as far as my knowledge goes. It's only an argument made against us. So here's my response to that argument, and that is to say that liberalism and liberal individualism exists within the very recognition that we are social animals. That is why it exists. If indeed we were atoms and we were all Robinson Crusoe on an island, what need would there be for liberalism? What need would there be for this idea of individual rights? Robinson Crusoe has no individual rights because he's not competing with anyone else over scarce resources. We have individual rights because we live in a world where there's more than one individual, and everyone has unlimited needs, and there's only a limited number of resources. And if there aren't any individual rights, we will kill each other. Yes, we will have these communities and we'll love each other and stuff, but we'll kill other communities. Without individual rights, this existence does not work. So liberalism is the recognition that man is a social animal, and in order to ensure that man can prosper, in order to ensure that man can get through life without being killed because of a carrot or something, or taking someone else's land, is to give him rights, is to say that you have these rights, you have this domain, this personal sphere, and that a lot of that is psychological. You get to decide. And to the extent that liberalism does see a role for the state's exclusive role is to recognize that right and to ensure that no one else gets in the way of you exercising that right. So we do know anarcho-capitalism, a branch of liberalism, says that no, the state is a total rejection of that. And I think the communitarians love the anarcho-capitalist position because it lays bare to which extent that community is compatible with liberalism. It's just I don't agree with them that mainstream liberalism or classical liberalism, as Hermann and I are, says that there's only the individual and the state. That's never what liberalism said. It when it comes to rights, the main actors are the individual and the state. But as I said earlier, liberalism is not all-encompassing. By saying what I just said, I'm not saying that groups do not exist. And indeed, I think I made this point in the debate, and it wasn't really addressed, that liberalism is the ultimate institutionalist ideology that I'm aware of. Liberals were the ones who have insisted on decentralization. Liberals have been the ones who have insisted on strong institutions to counter the power of the state. That is what liberals have been doing, very much to communitarians' dismay, because they want their state, the state that presides over their community, to have a free hand. So that's a long way, I guess, of saying that it's a total fallacy and definitely a misrepresentation of what the liberal position has ever been, to say that we believe in an atomistic individual, or that human beings are not social creatures, or that the group doesn't exist. That's never been the case. All that we as liberals insist on is that there be a rule. I guess there needs to be a rule that regulates this, how the group acts. And what this thing is, that what is the group, where does it start and where does it end, and that's determined by choice at the end of the day. And that's all that liberalism asks. I think we do ourselves a disservice by overanalyzing what exactly liberalism is. It's a very simple insistence.
And I think part of that very simple insistence is, if you're going to make the claim, I mean, part of why I don't like philosophy is I think it is, well, I like some philosophies, others not. But part of why I just generally dislike philosophical debates, because I think it loses a lot of traction in reality. But one of the points that I would make is that the existence of the individual as an actor is rational. The existence of the individual as a decider is rational. The existence of the individual, therefore, as an actor and a decider within a group whose actions and decisions he cannot or she cannot impact on, that is rational. So the position that the individual is the basis on which decisions and rights and all these things occur is intensely rational. If you're going to deviate from that, give me a good reason to deviate from that. Give me a good reason to think that there's a superiority in a group acting or a group being considered to be able to act in the first place. If you're going to go to the baker or I don't know, someone who really has grade 10 and that's the level of education, and they're working hard, providing for their family, go to them and try to convince them that that groups can do things, and that groups can decide as an internal, coherent, singular decider. Just test the rationality of your position against what is perhaps, almost by Occam's razor, to be the most obvious position. But there's a wonderful joke about Occam's razor. Someone asks, what's this thing called Occam's razor? Well, I guess it's a shaving tool belonging to someone called Occam. But the one thing that I also need to pick up from the debate, because this theoretical discussion is very interesting, but I do have to mention one thing from the debate, is I quite got annoyed and irritated by this idea that my commitment or my love of groups is somehow similar to the ANC's love of non-racialism and liberalism. That somehow I'm being disingenuous by being a member of a church or a family or a group of friends or an institution or having colleagues. That's somehow my position is morally equivalent to the National Democratic Revolution's idea of, at least using capitalism to fund its later socialism. And I just thought that that's quite unnecessary. I don't think that's good debating tactics. I don't think that's necessary, and I don't think it really advanced anyone's argument. So I must say that quite struck me as annoying. But even if we're going to go on atomistic, this idea of atomistic individualism, bloody hell, atoms interact. That's how matter becomes. At no point is anyone making the case for true atomism, but atomaticism. Not even the atoms are making that case. So it's just annoying. I don't want to call it straw manning, because a straw man at least consists of several straws.
Okay, well, I'm going to let the dig at philosophy slide for now because I'm supposed to be hosting, so I don't want to get into that. But just on the point about the NDR and the ANC, them using liberalism in a way, and that liberalism allows for this. I think one needs to be very careful of a particular group or a society or an organization, and if they want to attain their ends through force or through voluntarism. For me, a lot of it boils down to that. So, within the liberal framework, within a liberal country, there are going to be groups where, some people's individual rights, if they choose to be part of that group, are going to be suspended. If they choose to be part of the ANC that's pursuing the NDR, well, if the main commander or the main comrade says we're going to do X, then we do X. He decides for us. I think it's an important point that you raise, Hermann, that groups don't decide. It's for example the leaders in charge of the groups that decide. People in the groups give their consent. They go along with what the leaders decide. But I just wanted to touch on that bit. And Martin, Chris, you can take this forward. No, go ahead.
Can I stop you there? I think to make it an absolute point that philosophically or metaphysically groups can't decide, I wouldn't go that far. I think that there are some strong philosophies and metaphysical principles that could make group actors, but we heard none of it in the debate.
Sure.
That's the thing. If you're going to deviate from the obvious, give us good reason to deviate from the obvious. I'd be very, very glad to deviate from the obvious, because the obvious is then wrong. But if you're going to say a group can act, you have to deal with the metaphysical burden, the metaphysical lot that you are picking for yourself. And they didn't, and I don't think they did.
Right. Now, Martin, just for you there, that you can touch on what Hermann said now, and then also the point about force versus voluntarism, that because there's this charge against liberalism that it allows for this force to be imposed. And we can also get into the imperialist point there.
Yeah, so just briefly on what Hermann said, I agree. I mean, liberalism, again, totally recognizes that groups could in some ways decide, and I'm a jurist, and we call this company law. We have companies, they're groups, and companies are recognized as individuals, as persons. We call them persons in law. That is a group that decides. You have to jump through some hoops, but that's how any group decides. But on a basic, fundamental, biological point, it is always the individual. There are I don't know if it's electrons, electrodes that move around in our mind, and that is a decision that has been physically made inside your brain. At some point, you're going to be able. I think you can already see with scanners of the mind that you can see a decision has been made. You cannot scan a group and say that a decision has been made. So I think that's the insight that liberalism has, and that is to say that as a simple biological reality, the individual is the one who decides, and because the individual is the one who decides, the individual is the one with the responsibility for those decisions, and the individual must be the one with the freedom for that decision at the end of the day. And you can use that freedom to join a group and to submit yourself to the so-called decisions of the group and all of that. We absolutely do not disagree with any of that, and we're fine with so-called group decisions as long as the ultimate deciding ability of the individual is not in any way compromised by, for instance, the group colonizing another group. And I want to get into imperialism now to answer your question, Chris, or prohibiting people from leaving the group. If you are born into a group, you never decided to join that group, and I think you have here comes that word, an absolute right to say that I do not want to be part of this group, I am leaving. I think that no group can in any moral sense say no. That would be wrong. But let me quickly veer into this imperialism thing. I have a quote here that I saw earlier today.
Are we going on a global crusade now?
Who's your we? Who's your we? We're not a we. We are three guys.
I'm taking the decision on behalf of the group. Okay.
I have a love-hate relationship with imperialism, but I admit I am a minority amongst liberals on this. But let's leave that to for a separate discussion. The previous regime of South Africa, the apartheid regime, and its somewhat successor, the South African Party, the United Party, especially the people associated with what would become the National Party, were communitarians. I am not saying that the Ernsts are NP supporters. I'm not saying the Ernsts are apartheid supporters. What I am saying, and I'm limiting to what I'm saying now, is that the National Party were communitarians. I would consider myself to be something of knowledgeable on. I don't want to use the word expert nowadays on the history of the National Party. I have very thick books here written by National Party historians and written by enemies of the National Party. The National Party was communitarian. So the first leader of the National Party, General James Munich Barry Herzog, at a meeting on 7 December 1912, 2 years before he formally founded the National Party in Pretoria, said, and I will say it in Afrikaans and then translate it, imperialisme is vir my net goed sover dit dienstig is vir Suid-Afrika. Waar dit in botsing kom met die belange van Suid-Afrika, is ek 'n besliste teenstander daarvan. He said that imperialism, insofar as it serves the interests of the community, of his community of South Africa, is okay. Where imperialism conflicts with the interests of his community, his country, it's problematic. Now, this is fundamentally what all communitarians believe. You cannot say what Ernst Roets said yesterday, and I'm going to quote him. Communitarianism says communities make rules. but you do not impose rules on communities. That is his main criticism against liberalism, because we impose rules on communities. The communitarian position is to say the community decides the rules. You don't impose rules on the community. And I asked this in the comments on their live stream. Nobody answered it. I hope someone noticed it, but that is, the community gets together. They decide amongst themselves unanimously, all 2 million of them decide of one mind, we are going to invade our neighboring communities. So the community has now taken a decision. It has taken its sovereign decision to decide what the community is going to do. You do not impose rules on the community. Remember, you cannot do this. There are no rules on the community. So the community decides to be imperialistic. What is the communitarian answer to that? This idea that communitarianism is the antithesis of imperialism, I think, is totally wrong, because imperialism is, I think, always the result of a community either directly electing some leader or acquiescing to the decisions of that leader to invade their neighbors. And I'll get back to, I have no problem making the Nazi Germany example. I think Godwin's law is silly. It's a great example in recent history of what happens when liberal institutions are not respected, when the rights of the individual are not respected. I will not use that example. The Nazi ideology from the word go was about the German community, Volksgeist and all these things, the spirit of the community. The German people, my people, want this. They want Lebensraum. And who am I as the instrument of my community to say no to my community? Of course you're going to take Poland. Of course you're going to take France. Of course. That is what the community has decided. And that is what liberalism says. Liberalism says there are certain decisions that the community does not get to make. And those decisions relate to the rights of the individual, to the rights of the Jews, to the rights of the Gypsies. That is liberalism. It says that you can impose rules on communities. And we do impose rules on communities. And I say this for myself, I'm not speaking for any other liberals. I would impose that rule on communities by force, imperialistically. I don't think that there is any legitimacy in any community enforcing its will upon anyone else. And we have seen in history how disgusting it is when we let it happen. And I mean, the so-called liberal response here at United Nations, etc., have been totally useless. I do not identify with the United Nations. They did not intervene in Rwanda. They should have. They did not intervene in South Africa, and they should have. Sue me, please. That is not. I do not identify with that system, and I think that it's an important point to point out that at the end of the day, it is let me not call it communitarianism, but it's this appeal to community that has always been the driving force behind imperialism. Always. It's never been individualists and liberals doing it. Just me. I wish that were the case. I wish that that's what liberals and individualists did. I wish that they did that. They've never done that. It's always been the communitarians.
Martin, if I can jump in on something that you said there, I think you can almost put it in the negative. It's not that individualism decides what the group is not allowed to do. It is individualism, very much like the American Constitution. Individualism creates the group with certain functions, and that's it. That is why individualism is a safe form of community, because it creates the group with a very narrow mandate that it only gains from its individual members. And there's something very interesting that I actually want to pick up, and I'm so angry at myself that I didn't say it in the debate. If you want minority interests in South Africa to stand a chance, the communitarianists and the collectivists are your worst enemy. Why? Because if you're going to reduce actors to group actors, then it immediately becomes an issue. It's very much like what you said now, Martin. If the group decides to invade Poland, Poland being the smaller group, Germany being the Reich being the larger group, and no one may impose rules on the group. Remember, that's the Ernst Roets standard of communitarianism. No one may impose on the group decision. Then you have set up the perfect failure for minority interests, because no longer are you competing on individual rights, where even the strongest member of the of the majority is an individual, and even the meekest member of the minority is an individual. You move away from that metaphysical equal terrain of combat of ideas and combat of rights to ceding the ground that groups can act and that groups cannot be overruled in theory. Now we hit that problem of what is practical and what is theoretical, because history shows us how immensely impractical the idea that you cannot impose rules on the group is. How has that happened? How has it happened that groups have had rules imposed on them? By stronger groups. So if you are interested in minority interests in South Africa, then the communitarian is the worst ally you can possibly choose, because they cede the ground immediately that group actors can only be the level at which the competition is held. And then, whether it's part of the theory of the communitarianists or not, it's part of the practical realities that if groups are going to compete, it's going to be the strongest group that wins. That is the cruel reality of minority rights in South Africa. The best chance for minority rights in South Africa is an individualistic approach, where even President Cyril Ramaphosa, in the theory of an ideological, and perhaps we should come to that now. This Mogoeng is a liberal, Mogoeng is all liberalism. He's the alpha and omega of liberalism. The problem is South Africa has liberal elements. It's not a liberal democracy in the true sense of the word. We are struggling with this majoritarian oppression. We are struggling with several forms of majoritarian oppression. I mean, Cyril Ramaphosa, even within his own party, he's a vendor. He's not in the majority group there. And I've experienced firsthand how people use that to weaken his position. So we encounter this situation where we say, of course, South Africa isn't a perfect liberal democracy. No one ever said it was. But what I would venture to say is individualism, at least, like the free market, allows the morality of the community to manifest. And that is what the core here is. If you don't like the consequences of liberalism, then you just don't like the people. If you want to, one of the problems, Martin and I spoke about this recently, one of the problems with communitarianism, or one of the illustrations, is you don't want a nightclub or a strip club. Yeah, let's go there. You don't want, no, let's go worse. You don't want a brothel. Let's go brothel. You don't want a brothel next to a church. That's the problem. The community's mores are in jeopardy. Now, that brothel will only exist as long as enough individuals want to go there for sex. The individual can convince his community, if you want a bit of stupping, how about you don't do it next to the church? That's a possibility. But the problem is, if you're going to say that South Africa, Mogoeng, liberalism bad because Mogoeng bad judge, then you are just being incredibly dishonest. And by sin of the association, you are being impractical. It's not practical to say that liberalism lives in the judgments of Mogoeng. It's stupid. It's relatively dishonest if you're going to have an honest weighing of ideas. And that's why I asked more than once, is the liberal expected to literally stand in and be held accountable for the jurisprudence of Mogoeng? Problem is, on the individual perspective, he's an individual making stupid decisions. It's a pity he has a lot of power to make stupid decisions. But you cannot go into this idiocy. So this whole spiel, let me sum up my whole spiel very quickly. if you want minority rights to succeed in South Africa, stay as far away as possible from the collectivists and the communitarians. They are rigging the game against you because they are seeding the principle that you compete in group strength. And that's just majoritarian oppression. Secondly, where does this idea come from that South Africa is in the state it is, therefore liberalism bad? I mean, that's just, it's really silly. It's really silly.
Well, let me play devil's advocate a bit there, and let's say it's not just about Mogoeng, but about the liberal constitution. That's where the problems start. So it's not just about the person who embodies it, but it's about the constitution itself. And Herman, ek kan sien jy is baie opgewonde, maar kom ons gee net vir Martin 'n kans hierso. Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, so that is what the Ernst clarified last night, and that is that it might not be that Mogoeng is the liberal, but he sits at the head of the Constitutional Court, and this is in the Trias Politica, a liberal institution. The courts are expected to defend individual rights, and here we have this totally bonkers Constitutional Court that has thrown everything to the wind. I think let me start with saying that I am a big defender of South Africa's constitution, but at the same time I am not its biggest fan. I think that as liberals, we have very few instruments at our disposal in the current South African context, and I argue the Constitution is one of those few, and we are doing ourselves, and I think the communitarians are also doing themselves a disfavor by disavowing the Constitution. I think that doesn't help anyone. You are not going to establish some kind of polity or some society in the world as we know it today without being subject to some recognized constitutional law. You're not. It's not going to happen. So we have this constitutional law in South Africa, which I think is not that bad. I think that the Constitution got a lot of things right, and I think it got some things very, very wrong, and we are paying the price for that. But what it got right, we're also reaping the rewards of that. I mean, South Africa, it's actually amazing that what's it now, 26 years into multiracial or presumably non-racial democracy, I would class myself as one of the freest people in the world. I think as an individual sitting here right now, even with the lockdown, I am very, very free. I can go on, I can theoretically go on television for an FMF interview, and I can say the nastiest thing imaginable about the ANC, about the president, about cabinet, the worst thing that can possibly come into your mind. I will lose my job.
I just have to say, sorry,
but
Martin,
I will not go to prison.
I have to interrupt there, Martin. Sorry, I have to say, I work with Martin, everyone, and I've never heard him be this optimistic about the country. So please, this is a seminal moment. This is historic in liberalism in the country. Sorry, Martin, please go ahead. I just wanted to mark the occasion.
Excuse my optimism, but I can do that, and I will not go to prison. So it's I know there have been hiccups recently. Vicky Momberg, let me go out on a limb and say I think that was a very bad judgment. People should not be going to prison for hurting other people's feelings, and on the whole in South Africa, that is not happening. That case was as prominent as it was because it's definitely an outlier. So we are incredibly free in South Africa, but that does not mean we as liberals deny that the Afrikaans community has been severely undermined by our Constitutional Court. I am a massive opponent of the University of the Free State case, of the Pretoria street names case, although when it comes to public property, it gets iffy. But I think that the jurisprudence of the court there was just bad at the end of the day. But like Agri SA is the big one, the big standout, where the Constitutional Court, it basically amended the Constitution from the bench and said that expropriation without compensation is actually okay. It said so. What's it now? It's almost 2 decades ago, before EWC was being discussed as much as it is now. The Constitutional Court decided EWC is actually okay. Liberals don't have to defend that, because even though the Constitutional Court in theory is a product of the liberal constitutionalist idea, it doesn't mean that that cannot be perverted. And let me get back again to my example of communitarianism itself being perverted all throughout history. So I don't see why liberals have to own what the Constitutional Court says and own the consequences, when communitarians don't have to own the consequences of the immense tyranny and oppression that have been wrought upon minorities and upon individuals throughout human history, because that individual or that minority's interests somehow conflict with that of the community, of the majority. And this does speak, I think, to what the Ernst said, and that is that the community decides. Now, does that mean that when 50% plus one of the community decides, then that decision is made and there can be no dissent? Or does the allowability of dissent depend on whether the community allows dissent, and if it doesn't, then gulag? You see, it's just, you can't just put it all at liberalism's doorstep. And if I may just go on just briefly into the history again, liberals from the turn of the previous century have, and I'm not debating the Ernsts. What I'm about to say, it's not against them, but it's against a version of communitarianism. Liberals in this country have told the communitarian nationalists, they said, if you do what you are going to do now, what you are planning to do with this idea of the Union of South Africa, or these provisions that you have in these laws, if you go down this route, you're going to be okay. Your children's children are not going to be okay. Instead, let's have non-racial democracy, qualified vote, so it won't be a mass of illiterate voters expropriating property. And none of that will happen, but we need to adopt the non-racial principle now, otherwise your children will have trouble. That was what the liberals said. The nationalists told them, go away, we don't care. And they were quite open about saying, we're going to kick it down the road, and we'll deal with it then. So after about, what was it, 40 years of the liberal request that the one community not dominate another community, actually that individual rights be respected, that this simple request that blacks be allowed to own property in Pretoria. I mean, that why is that a problem? That's a simple request. These simple requests were ignored, and then around comes the middle of the century, and black South Africans, colored South Africans, and Indian South Africans say, well, okay, the liberals have been trying to make our case, but they're weak. And I'm the first to admit that for some reason the liberal movement has been incredibly weak in like the last century and a half, thereabouts. Incredibly weak. They've been weak. They haven't secured these simple rights that we insist on. And I remind everyone, the ANC wanted individual rights. They wanted property rights. The idea of expropriation, if you told the ANC in 1914 expropriating white property, they would have said that is a ludicrous idea. We will never do such a thing. But now, after all these years of collectivists saying, no, go away, liberals, they said, well, let's look elsewhere. Let's look for allies elsewhere. Let's see if someone else can get this done. And Comrade Stalin and Comrade Mao said, we're in your corner. We're in your corner. We're here for you. And the ANC became communist. They got in bed with communists. And fast forward to today, this was all eminently foreseeable. Liberals have been were warning against this. We said exactly this was going to happen if you don't do the decent thing and just respect individual rights. Let the blacks own property. Let the blacks have free speech. Let the blacks join trade unions, because this was now this is when the radical trade unionists, the Marxists, were all white, by the way. This is what liberals said. Just do the decent thing. We didn't. and now we have a dispensation that, and this had some of this seeped into the constitution, much to the liberals' dismay, whereby things like Mogoeng's Agrius 8 judgment, and whereby things like expropriation without compensation seem reasonable. It's something that can happen. Whereas in the US, if Trump says we're going to expropriate property without compensation, there will be a civil war. It's reasonable here because nobody heeded the liberals' warnings. So to say that the ANC started as a liberal organization and then there's this conduit from liberalism to communism, and look where we are today, it naturally happens. No. There was a series of historical events which put us in this place. The ANC didn't just become communist. It was after repeated attempts by liberals to say, listen, individual rights, classical individual rights, that were rejected. And the ANC said, well, okay, we need a different answer here. And they went for the Reds. And we all have to live with that now. And now again, we're liberals. We're saying, okay, you failed us then. Here is our next 100-year vision. And liberals tended to be right throughout history. It's going to be bad, guys. So let's go with the individual rights, the property rights, the free markets, and let's live harmoniously. But if we ignore this again, it's going to get worse. If you accept the collectivist principle, it's going to get worse.
The fact of the matter is, if you look historically, the main opposition to the NP, I think in the 60s, officially adopted their policy as apartheid with justice. Now, consider that. The choice that South Africa faced, that Black South Africans faced, wasn't, do we choose the government who will oppress us or the opposition who will fight for our freedom? No. It was, do we choose the government who will oppress us or the opposition who will oppress us nicer? That is why they went for allies. That is where the communism first came into the ANC, and this is a matter of historic record. I mean, the ANC was so pragmatic, to use the phrase to Martin Chagrin, but the ANC was so pragmatic that they ceased activities often during time of war. I think during the First World War, they said we put the country interest, how collectivist often, we put the country interest above this. We will not make life difficult for the Smiths government. We will cease our political activism and resume after the war. The ANC of 1912 was a different creature, and to imply, as Martin perfectly says, that the natural progression was from ANC 1912 to ANC 2012, to say that would ever been thus, would always have been that way, is to ignore history, and to ignore history in a fundamentally impractical way. So we have to make first things quite clear here. I want to come on to this point of Agrius and the jurisprudence of Mogoeng. The first thing that I would dare volunteer, and we've had a few risky statements from Martin, let me make a risky one. There's no such thing as a written constitution. There's no such thing as a written constitution. All constitutions are unwritten. It's just whether the point of reference is a document or tradition. That is it. So if you're going to look at the Constitution, you have to appreciate that you are looking at the reference document that will be used in unwritten ways to define the constitutional norms. The Constitutional Court treated the Constitution in that sense as amendable. Now, the document hasn't been amended, but the document isn't the Constitution, it's the reference for the Constitution. All constitutions, as Thatcher said, needs to be written on the hearts of the people. Now, the thing about, if you accept that constitutions are unwritten, then you can understand that Mogoeng deviated from what was constitutionally proper. There's no physical change. The Constitution, the black on white ink on the page remains the same, but that, if you think that Mogoeng acted within the Constitution, you're making the very stupid mistake of thinking that the document you're reading is actually the Constitution. No, it's the reference document. And remember this, all constitutions unwritten, either tradition or document, that's it. That's what you have. All constitutions are that way. From that then stems the abomination of the Agri-SA case. It's not an outflow of liberalism. It is a perversion of it. It is a direct perversion of the fundamental, beating heart cause of liberalism, the right to own property. Now, Mogoeng might say, in lieu of our liberal constitution, well, then he makes two mistakes. Firstly, to think that the Constitution is written and that just because the text hasn't been altered, the Constitution has remained unaltered. But he also makes the mistake of thinking that you can, I almost said a bad word, that you can mislead people with clever labels. And I think Mr. Roets has been misled. Mr. Roets, if he believes that the judgment in Agri-SA is a liberal one, he must probably think that the People's Democratic Republic of North Korea is both democratic and the people's. The label that you give to a concept does not determine its content. The fact of the matter is, look at the substance, look at the reality. Don't get lost in the theory, Mr. Roets. Look at the practicalities. And the practicalities are that the Agri-SA case is not a liberal judgment. It violates the core element of liberalism. I mean, if you were to confront John Locke and say, why did you allow the South African Constitutional Court to expropriate property without compensation? He would firstly ask you, where are you, freak of nature? Where do you come from? But then he would also say, what the hell do you mean? That is like saying North Korea is democratic because it's got democratic in the name. For Pete's sakes, people, look at the substance, look at the practicalities of what you're actually saying here. But I have to say something that I completely agree with Martin on, and I fear liberals might be repeating this mistake, is liberalism has been a terribly disappointing movement in South Africa. It's achieved some nice things. I genuinely think it's quite amazing that a socialist NDR organization on the one hand and a nationalist status organization on the other hand could arrive at the conclusion that individual rights to speech and the right to own property is worth including in the codification of this negotiated settlement. That's quite an achievement. Well done, liberals, on that one. But let me ask you, what have you done since? And I speak to most of us, actually. The liberalism has, I think, fallen into the parody and the caricature of itself. And that is, I think, where the Ernst do hit on something valuable. Liberals have denied, to their own detriment, the importance of society. They have denied to their own detriment the importance of tradition. They have denied to their own detriment the importance of symbolism, especially national symbolism. And that has given the critics of liberalism the ammunition to say that you're a bunch of atomists because they have behaved without an understanding of the inherent cohesion of human nature in terms of a societal creature, if we listen to Aristotle. Interestingly, I am probably one of the most personally conservative people I know. For Pete's sakes, I've gotten into debates on Twitter saying I would have voted against republicanism in 1960. I love the idea of a monarchy. I love the idea of the symbol, this group identification mechanism, this apolitical, traditional, historic remnant that we so associate with museums and not with civil society. I like those stuff. I like Western architecture because it's pretty. I like new Gothic buildings because they're old. But the fact is that if you're going to be a liberal, that doesn't mean that your preferences are to be enshrined in the structures of power of your society. That's not liberalism. Liberalism is to say the only thing to be enshrined in executive mandate is the freedom of the individual to choose. Then the individual can be Amish, then they can move to Orania, or they can become a very weird hermit in the I'm sure you have those liberals out there. But the reality is If the liberals want to make a difference, they're going to have to man up. Simple as that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a practical question. So getting from the history to the now and maybe the future, because as we know, heading out of the lockdown, we're going to get structural reform and radical economic transformation that are not
We're heading out
nor...
of the lockdown?
Okay, well, at some point, I've got an inside track. Okay, so let's not question that. We're going to get structural reform and RET, which are neither structural reforming nor radical. They're going to continue the same failed ideas of the past. In no way are they going to improve the economic problems that have been caused up until now. So one of the questions we've had on YouTube is which liberal country will impose sanctions if the ANC goes ahead with EWC? So there's a practical concern and a question. Is that a fair question to ask about liberal countries? Are there any particular liberal countries that stand out? I think Hermann is a bit upset with that one. Like us, if But please go. You take this one first.
No, that's just my face. No, it's a good question. I'll be very short. It's not that I've swallowed something bitter. It's just my face. It's the face of a bitter man. But the thing is, we have nominally liberal countries like the UK and the US and perhaps even Australia and those countries. I don't think if liberalism actually on the international geopolitical stage has the guts to impose sanctions. So on a practical level, I've never bought into the idea that the outside world will come to save South Africa. I'm afraid I don't believe in supranational bodies to be the arbiters of right and wrong in a sovereign nation. And Martin and I have some, I think, differing views on the sovereign nation. But the practicalities is you might be as right as it is possible to be in Hong Kong. You're still next to China. So the thing is, I don't know if any liberal democracies will have the guts to do what is necessary, and that's certainly a point of criticism against liberalism. I wouldn't shy away from that for a moment, but it's not a failure of ideals; it's a failure of will.
Yeah, if I can just, I think that's part of. And you probably will disagree with my conclusions from this, but this is part of, I would say, the emasculation of liberalism. Now, I guess we should have mentioned this earlier, but Hermann and I are classical liberals. Lots of things are called liberal today. Lots and lots of things are called liberal today because it has always been a very respectable descriptor. Ideally, no one can oppose the idea of being liberal. You're generous, you're tolerant, you're open. It's always been a respectable term. And so the socialists wanted the term and they won that battle. They took the term in the middle of the previous century. It was somewhat gradual and then really sped up towards the middle of the previous century. Hermann and I do not, I would believe, identify with much of what has happened under the mantle of liberalism recently, because we simply reject that is liberalism. They disagree with the very fundamental tenets of liberalism. It's not an impractical application of liberal principles like communists who apparently misapplied communist principles. These people are not trying to apply liberal principles. They're applying socialist and other principles that have nothing to do with liberalism. So just on that, but from classical liberals, we've been very emasculated, and to the extent that countries like the United States and the UK, but let's focus on the US, the undisputed superpower of the world, which still has many vestiges of classical liberalism in its very constitutional makeup, in its political culture, that has also been emasculated. At some point, classical liberalism, lost confidence in itself. We see this today in certain political parties in South Africa, where many politicians who are, I think an argument can be made, quite classically liberal, they're always apologizing. And I sit here watching these press conferences, and I'm like, why are you so apologetic about these things? It's like when a racist kicks someone, they own a small business, they kick someone off their property because they don't want them there. Don't be apologetic about that. That's great. We now know this person is a racist. We should ostracize him. We should boycott them. and I made this point in the previous in the debate. This liberal institution of private property. I think we're the only ones who can claim that private property is ours. It's our institution, and it's so versatile. It's great. It enables us to do so much, but we apologize for it, and it's specifically about the right to private property and the free market, which is a consequence of that. We've lost confidence in that, and I don't know if it's because we've lost academia because we don't have as many studies in our corner as we used to have. That might be all part of it. I think colonialism was a massive blow to classical liberalism. I think that the classical liberal countries, having had colonies and having done some pretty despicable things to the native populations, have definitely caused, and we call this white guilt today, but I think it's more of a Western guilt and by implication a classical liberal guilt, whereby we don't want to say these things too loudly because we carry some culpability for having done something terrible in the past. I find that all deeply problematic, and I am the first one to admit we're weak. We're weak as classical liberals right now. And I might add, just so that the communitarians don't think they're getting away with this, I think proper communitarians like our opponents are also incredibly weak all around the world. We see secessionist movements around the world just getting slapped down, and the UK leaving the EU was not secession. Please don't start with come on.
That's just a reassertion of sense.
Yeah, it's not gonna happen. So if the Amish want to secede from the United States, it's not happening. It's just not happening. If Catalonia, I guess a liberal rooting for the underdog. They were quite socialist, but like at some point there, I was like, wow, this would be interesting if they actually got free, but it didn't happen. So communitarianism, bona fide communitarianism, like I believe the two Ernsts are representatives of, is just as weak, if not weaker, than classical liberalism. So I'm not gonna let them get away with that. But that answers the question of sideliner opinions, who's now asked about why are liberals so quiet about human rights in China and Saudi Arabia, which liberal university is a bastion against socialism and communism, and why did the liberal West fight against apartheid but not against Zimbabwe? Well, it's because there's a weakness, and I mean, we can't deny that. I would want the West to be far more proactive, and I would have liked the United Nations, and this is where me and Hermann probably disagree. I would have liked the United Nations to have come out of the Second World War as an organization that stood up for the maybe a bit less than the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but that's okay, and actually said, no, you don't get to decide whether to implement the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We will decide that for you, and if you don't comply, we'll come help you do it. That is what I would have wanted. That is not what happened. Instead, like I said, what passes for liberalism today has taken over all of these organizations. And don't get me started on academia. It's not liberal. It's outright socialist. It's Marxist, critical theory, etc. Critical whatever. So
aren't we the allies of the Marxists? No, I'm kidding.
Right. Yes. Yeah, if I think that should be a podcast all on its own. This thing about this conduit from socialism to Marxism, and then I see someone is asking a very simple question: what exactly is classical liberalism? Well, it's liberalism as originally envisioned. So liberalism, the word comes from the Latin libertas, simply means freedom, and that simply the classical liberals simply mean that the individual human being should be left alone to decide for themselves about their property, about their affairs, etc., and the government should only ensure that freedom is, that little bubble around the individual is protected. That's not to say he's an atom. He can decide to be in a community, and he will decide to be in a community, etc. That's classical liberalism. Social liberalism today is very interventionist, very socialist, imposing economic theories on people. So just briefly, the difference.
Can I want to say a few things that I think. I think liberalism, classical liberalism, in the true sense, is weak. But if someone had said to me in the 1970s that 10 years from now you would have a Gladstonian liberal in Downing Street 10, and you would have a classical liberal in the White House, I would have called them delusional. The fact is, the 1970s was an awful, awful time for the world economically, and especially for Britain and the US. They were in decline globally. The Soviet Empire was really, really on this, not in the ascendant, but it was the era of peak emasculation for the liberal tradition. And along came Thatcher, and along came Reagan. Now, you can criticize Reagan for a lot of things, and for the size of the government during his time, and whether there's a lot to be said. But at core principle, you had two liberals in the Cold War. You had two liberals, Thatcher and Reagan, really taking the world by storm. And it's a very interesting thing. This why did the West fight against apartheid? They didn't. The border war was actually just another satellite proxy war of the Cold War. It was like Afghanistan, but on a tinier scale. And the question the West faced in Angola specifically is, we have national communitarianist collectivism versus communism, and which one do we want to win? And they went for national communitarian collectivism because it had more elements of free market economics in it, and I think they made broadly the right call. But the thing is that I think it's a depressing time to be a liberal, but it's also the best time to be a liberal. Because this is the time when the next Thatcher, the next Reagan, the Thomas Sowell will appear. They might already be somewhere in Parliament. They might be in the Institute of Race Relations somewhere, or in the Free Market Foundation, or in AfriForum, or in Urania. Somewhere on this planet, there might be the next Thatcher and the next Reagan. And there's a wonderful young politician in the UK House of Commons that I want everyone to start following after this. And that's a young woman called Kemi Badenoch. She grew up in Nigeria, and her maiden speech in the House of Commons is the greatest short summary of what is wrong with a strong state and why the individual and liberalism is the pursuit. And perhaps I could end that answer with a very quick quotation. Against the wall in our offices, if we ever, by God's grace, return to them, is a mural that reads, "We stand for classical liberalism, an effective way to defeat poverty and tyranny through a system of limited government, a market economy, private enterprise, freedom of speech, individual liberty, property rights, and the rule of law." To me, that sums up classical liberalism pretty good.
I hate to go on there from Hermann, because that was such a good note on which to end. But in the interest of people to follow, things to read, that sort of thing, I would like both of you to just wrap up on the note of any writers in the past. And Martin, you're not allowed to say yourself, because I know you want to punt your own books and articles, but just any thinkers in the liberal tradition, any writers that you think, that you recommend people look into, anyone that you recommend they follow on social media if they're interested in reading up more and exploring more, especially on liberalism.
So I'm quite straightforward with this. So I would say that there's a Frenchman from the 1800s by the name of Frédéric Bastiat. He wrote some incredibly easy to understand and follow articles and essays, and he wrote a book called The Law. That is, to me, even more so than John Locke, the quintessential summary and culmination of what really liberalism is, what this idea of individual freedom is. And please, if you're a communitarian, I would also encourage you to read it, because he does talk about the importance of the collective coming together to create this institution called the law for the common defense. And it shows brilliantly how communitarianism is not some enemy of liberalism, or liberalism is not some enemy of communitarianism. So Frédéric Bastiat, a lot of his other work, he wrote specific a lot on economics. It's available for free online. Then I have to punt the person who brought me into liberalism, although he would balk at the idea of being described as a liberal, and that is one Murray Rothbard. He was a anarcho-capitalist. And the specific book, which I believe you can also find for free online, is The Ethics of Liberty. So you'll be shocked. He is going to rally against the state's existence per se, but you don't have to go along with that. Just immerse yourself in what he's saying about the nature of human freedom and why it is that we as individuals are in fact entitled to this individual freedom. Yeah, I think that's basically it. That's the two that come to mind immediately. I'm not big on the economics of it. I'm sure Henry Hazlitt and Friedrich Hayek are great people to read also on that. And then just from South Africa's history, I cannot recommend Edgar Harry Brooks, his work highly enough. He co-wrote a book called Civil Liberty in South Africa that the Institute of Race Relations initiated, but it was published by Oxford University Press, 1958. It's still being sold secondhand online, so you can find it. Great book, great author, and I think he's definitely one of our best classical liberals from the previous century.
So I just quickly want to check that the Institute of Race Relations started this process, but the Oxford University Press published it. Yeah, I can see
the book was sponsored by the IRR, but Oxford published.
Yeah, I can see the liberals and the imperialists just bootying up to each other. I'm going to. I don't think I've ever been really intelligent enough to read political philosophy. I try, and I try to understand it. But if I were to recommend something, it would be the biographies of great classical liberals. That I think is very useful. There's tragically not a lot written on William Ewart Gladstone, from where Gladstonian liberalism, as I count myself, comes from. Thatcher's autobiography, Downing Street, Years, Path to Power, excellent. You can read the abridged versions; they're good. You can read Charles Moore's biography of Thatcher. I think that would be good. William Wilberforce, another liberal politician famous for the fight against the slave trade. And then YouTube, use YouTube. Watch every single interview with Thomas Sowell you can find, and watch Reagan's speech in 1963, A Time for Choosing. It's part of the great liberal tradition. But yeah, William Buckley's in the firing line, Thomas Sowell, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan. Go to YouTube, go to town. That's a good start. And then from there, I went to the biographies, from the biographies to the von Misers and so on, and the Hayeks. But if you're looking for the gateway, the marijuana, the first light drug to get you into this disappointing nest of vipers and commie bastard pinkos, then you definitely need to go to YouTube and enjoy a bit of Reagan and Thatcher.
I'm a bit disappointed that both of you went for the soft stuff and didn't go for the hard drugs, the Atlas Shrugged, but I'll let that go for the time being.
No, that's another podcast.
Okay, cool, guys. Thank you. I think we'll wrap up on that note. Before we go even further, we will let the rest of you enjoy your Friday nights. Look forward to all the freedom that comes with lockdown level 3 next week. I hope you all behave, that you don't engage in anarchy and just go crazy. Just don't enjoy your absolute freedom to the detriment of others. Guys, from you.
And can I just say something? I just want to say something that I think the communitarianists, the collectivists, and individuals can come together on this point. When people zol, they put saliva on the paper and then they pass that zol. So in that you have the individual making the zol, putting the saliva on the paper, but then the communitarianist idea of sending that zol around.
There we go. On that straw man and that very facetious point, we will wrap up. Guys, all of you watching, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your time. I hope you found it interesting and worth your while. Martin, to you and to Hermann, thank you very much for joining me this evening. I've enjoyed it a lot, and hopefully we'll do a lot of this going forward. But for now, we will sign off. Enjoy your weekends. Cheers.